We continue now at the top of Daf Kuf Yud Beis Amud Aleph Meseches Babba Kamma. This is Babba Kamma Daf 112a. On the previous summit, the Gemara asked a question on Rami Bar Chamma. Rami Bar Chamma said that Yush and Shinoi Rishus is Kona, and the Brisa says that if you have a situation of Shinoi Rishus, but the Gezela is still around, it's inherited by the children, we say that they are chayiv to pay back the Gezela, even though it's a situation of Yush and Shinoi Rishus. We should say, according to Rami Bar Chamma, it's Kona, and they shouldn't be chayiv. And the Gemara answers on behalf of Rami Bar Chamma that he'll understand the Brisa is talking Lifnei Yush. It's talking before the original owner gave up hope. As Rashi says, Lifnei Yush, the Shinoi Rishus below Yush lo kani. Meaning now it's just talking about a situation of Shinoi Rishus when it goes to the children. In such a situation without Yush, that does not create a kinyan. And that's why when the Gezela is still around, there is no kinyan, they have to return it. The question then becomes, what about when the Gezela is not around? Rashi explains, V'chi ein Gezela kayemes. If the Gezela is not around, meaning she'achlua acharei mos avin, that they ate it after their father died, peturin, so they're going to be potter in that case. The question is, why are they potter? If it's talking about where there was no yish, so then they should become gazlonim when they consume it. And to that, Rashi says, the less later Rav Chisda, because Rami Bar Chamma does not hold the Rav Chisda. Rav Chisda actually does say that if they consume it after the death of their father in a situation of no yish, that they are responsible like gazlonim, but Rami Bar Chamma disagrees with that point of Rav Chisda. And the Gemara continues, Rav Ada bar Ahava masni lahad Rami Bar Chamma ahar. Rav Ada bar Ahava, he says that the teaching of Rami Bar Chamma was actually going on the following brisa. The brisa says, Hiniach len avi and mos shel ribis. If their father leaves over for them money of ribis that's supposed to be returned, it's money of interest, afa pisha yodin shein shel ribis, even though they know that is money of ribis, ein chayav and lahachzer, they don't need to return that money. And on that brisa, Rami Bar Chamma makes his comment. Rami Bar Chamma says, Zos Omeres, this brisa proves, Rishus Yoresh ki Rishus Lokeach Dami, that the Rishus of the Yoresh is considered to be like the Rishus of the Lokeach, and so therefore in this situation there is a Shinoi Rishus, and since there's a Shinoi Rishus, they acquire that money, they don't need to return it. And the Gemara continues, Rava Amar Rava says, Li'olamei malach Rishus Yoresh lav ki Rishus Lokeach Dami. Really, I will say to you that the Rishus of the Yoresh is not the same as the Rishus of the Lokeach. If that's the case, why doesn't the Yoresh have to return the ribis? And the Gemara explains, V'shani hoch, it's different over here. Tiyamar Kra, because the pasuk says, Al tikach me'ito neshech v'sarbis. You shouldn't take from him ribis, you shouldn't take from him interest. And the pasuk goes on to say, V'yoreisa mi'alokecha v'chei achicha imach. It says that your brother should live with you. We understand that to mean ahadir that you should return it to him, ki heichi denechi ba'adoch, in order that he should live with you. And that means to say, L'didei kamazer le'rachmana. To him, the Torah warns to return the interest. However, livrei, but to his son, lo mazer le'rachmana, the Torah doesn't issue such a warning. And the Gemara continues and explains, Man demasni la brisa, the one that learns Rami Bar Chamma's teaching on the brisa, kol shekena masnisin, he would certainly say that on the Mishnah, and Man demasni la masnisin, but the one who learns the teaching of Rami Bar Chamma on the Mishnah, aval la brisa, but when it comes to the brisa, Rami Bar Chamma kerava masni la, Rami Bar Chamma would agree with Rava. And Rashi explains, Man demasni la lahad Rami Bar Chamma brisa, the one that learns the teaching of Rami Bar Chamma, that Rishus Yoresh is Rishus Lokech, it's like a different Rishus, and therefore you don't have to return the ribis. You learn that on the brisa. So Kol Shekena Masnis, and certainly when it comes to Gezela, you don't have to return the Gezela because Rishus Yoresh is Rishus Lokech. Why is it Kol Sheken on the Mishnah? The Leka Taima Acharina Lemifre, because there is no other reason to say Potter in the Mishnah by the case of the Gezela. Elahai, rather, this is the only reason to say Potter. Kol Kam Delo Mechaseres and as long as you don't start changing words, taking out words in the Mishnah, mashma the gzela kayemis, it does sound like the Mishnah is saying that the gzela is still in front of us, and so the only reason to say potter is to say Rishus Yoresh is Rishus Lokeach. So again, if you learn Rami Bar Chamma's statement that Rishus Yoresh is Rishus Lokeach by the ribis case, you'll certainly learn it in the Mishnah. And Rashi continues, Man demasni la masnisin, the one that learns the teaching of Rami Bar Chamma in the Mishnah, that Rishus Yoresh is Rishus Lokeach, and that's why they don't have to return the gzela, avala brisa, but then you could say that on the brisa, Rami Bar Chamma misham taima dekra masnila. That Rami Bar Chamma gives a different explanation of the brisa. When it comes to ribis, the reason why the son doesn't have to return it is because of the pasuk of al tikach mito neshech v'sarbis, kirava, just like Rava explains. And Rashi notes, Lishna Achrina, there is another version of this part of the Gemara that Ipcha Garsin, and it should be exactly the opposite the text of the Gemara. And according to that, the Girsa would be as follows, Man demasni la masnisin, if you learn Rami Bar Chamma and the Mishnah, Kol Sheken HaBraisa, certainly on the Braisa, meaning to say, demasnisin ikol ukma b'sha'achlam, in the Mishnah, it would have been possible to say that we're talking about a situation where the Gezela is no longer around, they ate it, Aval Braisa katani sheyodin shein shel ribis. But in the Braisa you can't say that because it says they know the money is money of interest. Alma de kaimi bein, we see that the money is right there in front of us. The katani peturim, and it says pater. The rishus yoresh ki rishus lokech. You have to say that the reason is that the rishus of the yoresh is like a different rishus. It's like the rishus of the lokeach. Umad demasi lo abraisa, but if you learn it on the brisa, you learn the teaching of Rami Bar Chama. Aval amas nisim. But then you could say that when it comes to the Mishnah, Rami Bar Chama b'sha'ach lamasni lo karava. Rami Bar Chama will assume that there in the Mishnah we're talking about a situation where the money is no longer present. That's why we say pater, and that would be like Rava. But Rashi says v'rishon shamativ. I heard the first explanation, v'ikr, and that is the main explanation. And the Gemara continues, Tana Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, Hagozel machel as banav, if somebody steals and feeds it to his children, Petur milashalim, they are pater from paying. Hiniach lifneim, but if he leaves it in front of them, the item is still there, it's still present. So gedolim chayav and lashalim, if they're adults, they have to pay it back. Ketanim, if they're minors, Petur milashalim, they don't have to pay it back. V'imamru gedolim, but if the adult children say, Ein anu yodin chashbonos, shechashav avinu imach, we don't know all the calculations that our father made with you, we don't know exactly if there's responsibility, Petur, and then they are pater, they're exempt. The Gemara asks, Misham da'amri ein anu yodim peturim, just because they say they don't know, that means they're pater. Amar Rava says, Hachi Kamma, this is what it really means to say, Gedolim sha'amru, if the adults say yodim anu, on the contrary, we do know, Cheshbono shechashav avinu imach, we know all the calculations that our father had with you, Velo pashalach gabe velo midim, we know that nothing is owed, so then peturim, in that situation, they're going to be pater. And Rashi explains, Gedolim chayavim, again, if the item is still in front of us, so then if they're adults, they're chayiv. For Rami Bar Chama, mukilo lefnei yish, again, Rami Bar Chama is going to have to say that in this situation we're talking it was before yish, because according to Rami Bar Chama, if it was after yish, you have yish and shinur reshus, and they would certainly be pater. Now, ketan and peturim, but the Brisa did say that if they're minors, they're pater. Delav b'nei dinaninu, you can't take minors to court. V'afapi de gezela kayemes, even though the gezela is right in front of us, miu mechzer guvain, it still does need to be collected. V'sumchis hu de pater ketanim lekaman, this is the opinion of Sumchis, that the minors are exempt. We'll say that later on. Ve'ein anu yodin cheshbonos, then it said that if they don't know the calculations, then they're pater. V'shemo avinu chishav lach damim, maybe our father took care of it. But the Gemara asked me, Mishum de'ein yodin peturim, just because they don't know they're pater? Bitmiya, that's a wonder. Hoel v'yodim shebegazela bali yado, de bari v'shemo bari yado. If this is a situation where they know it was originally stolen, you have one party that's certain, the other one that doesn't know, you certainly should go by the party that is certain. And so then the Gemara changed it. Rava changed it and said the case over here is that they do know, they are certain that nothing is owed. And the Gemara continues, Tanya Idach, we learned in another brisa, Hagozel machel banav, if somebody steals and he feeds it to his children, Petur meleshalm, they're pater from paying. Hiniach lifneim, if he leaves it in front of them, Va'acholim, and then they eat it, Bein gedolim, bein ketanim chayav, and whether you're talking about adult children, whether you're talking about children that are minors, they're going to be chayiv. The Gemara asks on this, Ketanimi mechayiv, you're going to say minors are chayiv. Lo yehayela da'azik azuk, it should be no different than a minor going ahead and doing damage. A minor is not responsible for damage. Rashi says, Lo yehayela da'azik azuke nichnas l'chotzer de nigzel. Let's say they would have entered into the chotzer of the nigzel, v'hizik, when done damage. Mi mechayvi ketanim l'shalim, would ketanim be chay for that? V'anon tanan la'el, v'hem shechavlu ba'acherim peturim. We learned in the Mishnah earlier that if they damage others, they're pater. V'acha kevan da'achlam, man kafilu l'shaluma. Here, if they're the ones that consumed it, again, he left it over, he died, he left it to them, and then they ate it, who's going to force them to pay? They're not chayiv for damage. And so therefore the Gemara says, Amar Papa says, Hachi Kamma, this is what the Brisa means to say. Hiniach lifneim, if the father left the gezela to them, it's still in front of them after he died, va'adayin lo achlam, and they still haven't eaten it, they still haven't consumed it, bein gedolim, bein katanim chayav, and then whether they're adults, whether they're minors, they're going to be chayav. It's talking about when the gezela is still in front of us. And Rashi explains, Hiniach lifneim va'adayin lo achlam, he left it in front of them, and they still have not consumed the gezela. Afilu katanim chayavim, then we say that even minors are going to be responsible. Kevan de gezela kayemis, b'reshusa demarhu, since the gezela is still around, it's considered in the reshus of the original owner. And Rashi points out that this does not contradict what we said earlier, because this is a different Tana. V'rabbanan hu depligi oled sumchus. This is the sheet of the Rabbanan that argue on sumchus. V'lo tikshi abraisa de le'el. So this will not be a question on the earlier brisa. Damar gedolim chayav and katanim peturim. The earlier brisa said that adults are chayav and katanim are pater. That's because that follows sumchus. Here where it says the katanim are chayavin, that follows the Rabbanan. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rava says, Hiniach lem aviyam parash she'ul, if their father leaves them a cow that is borrowed, meaning to say the father borrowed the cow, and now the sons inherit, so to speak, that borrowed cow, mishtamshin ba kol yemei she'elda, they're allowed to use that cow for the entire duration of the terms of the borrowing. And Mesa, but if that cow dies, Ein Chayavin Bo'onseh, they're not Chayiv in the Ones, even though normally a Shoel is Chayiv in Onsim, but here when you're talking about the Yorshim, they are not Chayiv in Onsim. And Rashi explains, Ein Chayavin Bo'onseh, Delo Kabilu Alayna Tirusa. The reason is that they never accepted the responsibility of watching it, so therefore, again, they continue to use it during the terms of the borrowing, but they are not responsible for any Onsim. Kisvurim Shalaviyim. Now it says, let's say they thought that what they were inheriting actually belonged to their father. They didn't realize that it was a borrowed cow. V'tavchu avachlu, and they slaughtered it and they ate it. In that case, Meshalmin Demei Basar Bezol. They pay the amount of meat, but they value it at the cheaper rate. They don't have to pay the full price. Rashi explains, Bezol, Kol Zuzah Chashvina Ba'ar Badanki. Every zuz, instead of counting it as a zuz, it's only 4 danki. V'chein Kol Hecha Detani Bezol. That's true every time it says Bezol. Beperak Misha Meis in Baba Basra. V'hainu Shnei Shlishi Damim. What it amounts to is 2/3 of the value. They only have to pay 2/3 of the value in this case. And Rashi says, V'kulu Damim Lo Nishlamu. They don't have to pay the entire value. Dihavi Yodi Debo Shalume, because had they known that they had to pay, Lo Hava Achli Bisra, they certainly wouldn't have eaten the meat. Now, V'ha'or Rashi says, when it comes to the hide, Yachzirenu Kamoshu, that they should return as is. And finally, Rava concludes, Hiniach lem aviyam achrayis nechasim. If their father leaves them achrayis nechasim, which essentially means he leaves them land and there's a lien on that property, so then chayav and l'shalim. So then they do have to pay. They have to pay from that land. Now the question is, what exactly is this line going on? Because it said that number one, they're not responsible for onsim. So it could be it's going on that line. If their father leaves them achrayis nechasim, they are responsible for onsim. Or it could be going on the line where it says if they thought it was their father's and they slaughtered it and they ate it, they only have to pay 2/3 the amount. Maybe if it's achrayis nechasim, they have to pay the full amount. And so the Gemara has two versions of that. Igo Damasni La Reisha. There are those who say that this line of Achrayas Nechasim go on the Reisha, the case where they're responsible or they're not responsible for Onsim, they are responsible if there's Achrayas. Igo Damasni La Seifa. There are those who learn it on the Seifa that they normally pay Demei Basar Bezol. Now they don't if there's Achrayas Nechasim. And the Gemara elaborates, Man Damasni La Reisha, the one who says that on the Reisha, meaning that they're chayiv in Onsim if there's Achrayas Nechasim. So Kol Shekei Seifa, certainly they're going to be chayiv to pay the full amount and not Demei Basar Bezol if they slaughter and eat it. Upliga de Rav Papa, and that understanding would argue on what we're about to quote from Rav Papa. But Man Damasni La Seifa, the one who learns it on the Seifa, that would be again that they don't pay the Demei Basar Bezol if there's Achrayas Nechasim, but they pay the full amount. Avola Reisha Lo. But then in terms of the Reisha, in terms of being chayiv in Onsim, they would not be chayiv in Onsim just because there's Achrayas Nechasim. V'hainu de Rav Papa, and that would be the same thing as what Rav Papa says. And what does Rav Papa say? D'Amar Rav Papa, because Rav Papa says, Haisa para genuva lo, if he has a cow and it's stolen v'tavcha b'Shabbos, and he slaughters it on Shabbos, meaning to say he stole the cow, but then he does the slaughtering of the cow on Shabbos. So in that case, normally when you violate Shabbos at the same time that you also do something which is going to be mechayiv you a monetary obligation, we apply the rule of kimle b'derabamine. We say you only get the stronger punishment. You're chayiv misa on Shabbos. You don't have to pay the money. But in this case, already it was stolen before Shabbos. It was slaughtered on Shabbos. So the violation of slaughtering on Shabbos is a violation. That's a capital offense, chayiv misa. However, in terms of the stealing, chayiv is going to be chayiv. Shekvar chayiv begeneva kodem sheyavuli de Yisr Shabbos, because he had already done the geneva. He was chayiv in the geneva before the violation of Shabbos came along. But haisa para she'ulalo. But let's say he had a cow that was borrowed to him v'tavcha b'Shabbos, and he slaughtered that on Shabbos. So there he's going to be patur in that situation. He's going to be exempt from paying she'isr Shabbos v'isr geneva boin kechad, because there the violation of Shabbos, which is the slaughtering of the animal on Shabbos, that comes at the same time as the isr geneva, because the isr geneva only comes in that case when he actually slaughters the animal. And the idea over here is that according to Rav Papa, the chiyuv of a shoel in onsim takes effect at the time of the onus, not at the time of the borrowing. That's why over here, when he shechts it on Shabbos, he shechts the borrowed cow on Shabbos, it's considered that Isser Shabbos and Isser Geneva is at the same time. Again, the chiyuv is at the time of the onus, and therefore, if Rava would have made the statement on the Reisha, meaning to say, Rava would say that if there's achrayas nechasim left by the father, then they are responsible when the borrowed cow dies. That would not be like Rav Papa, because that would assume that the chiyuv on the onus takes place from the time of the borrowing, and that's why when the father leaves over land, there was a lien on the land from the time of the borrowing. But if you're going to say again like Rav Papa, that the obligation in onsim only takes place at the time of the onus, that achrayas nechasim that the father left them is not going to make a difference. And Rashi explains, Zika Damasni Laha Hiniach Lenavi and Achrayis Nechasim Chayav, and there are those that learn that statement of Rava, that if the father left them property with a lien on it, then they're Chayiv, that's going on Resha, that's going on the first part of the statement of Rava, meaning the Kamar Mesa Ein Chayavin Bo, and so it said that if the animal dies, so the Yorshim are not Chayiv in the accident, Vim Hiniach Lenavi and Karkos, but if the father left land, Chayavin L'Shalom, then they would have to pay the Ishtabin Nechasim Mechayim De'avun, because then there was a lien from when their father was alive, and the idea is that if you learn it that way, the Kasava Rava, then Rava holds Chiyav Onsim Mishas She'elam Mutal Ala Shoel, that the Chiyav of Onsim from the time of the borrowing it applies to the borrower. Upliga de Rapapa, that would argue in Rapapa Damar Lakamon Lo Rami Chiyav Onsim Ashoel Ad Shosh Atayonis, because Rapapa says that the Chiyav of Onsim doesn't apply to the Shoel until the time of the accident itself. However, V'ika Damasni Lo Asefer, there are those that learn this concept of Achrayis Nechasim of Rava. It's going on the later part of the statement of Rava, meaning Tavchu V'yachlu Meshalmim Dmei Bas, that if they slaughter and they eat the animals and then they pay for it, but they only pay the cheaper rate, but if the father left them land, then they have to pay the full amount to have an inu b'makom avun, because the idea there is that they are now in the place of their father. They've inherited this land which has a lien on it, and since they themselves ate the animal, so they do have to pay, again using this achrayas nechasim. But Rashi continues, aval aresha, but again, if you learn the statement of achrayas nechasim on the sefer, then in terms of the Reisha, the Mesa Kedarka, where it died in the normal fashion, so then they wouldn't be chayiv. The lo aminan ishtabin nechasim. We don't say that there's a shiba nechasim to lo rami chiyav onsen ala shoel ad shas onsen, because the chiyav of onsen doesn't apply until the time of the onus. V'hacha kiyisnasan, here at the time of the onus, less l'shoel, the actual borrower is no longer, he's not around. V'hani lo kabul alayomidi, and these people didn't accept anything upon themselves, and so therefore the fact that he left achrayas nechasim is not relevant. And so then the Gemara said, "V'hainu de Rapapa damar haisapara genuvalo." Then that would be the same as Rapapa, who said that if the cow was stolen, meaning kolomar gonav para me'erev Shabbos. The idea here is that let's say he stole the cow before Shabbos, on erev Shabbos, v'tavach b'Shabbos, and then slaughtered on Shabbos. So in that situation with the geneva, so chayiv, he's going to be chayiv. Af b'tashlumin arba v'chamishin, he'll even be chayiv 4 or 5 times the amount. Sharein is chayiv b'keren kodem shiyavu lidei eser skila, because there, where it's a situation of geneva, he was already chayiv to pay the keren before the violation of Shabbos, before the Yisr Skila. V'yafagav de knasa lo asir la'ad Shabbos. Now, even though the fine itself didn't happen until Shabbos, because he didn't slaughter till Shabbos, lo patrina le miknasa. That's not enough to exempt him from the knas, even though there's a capital punishment over here. Misham chiyab misa, just because of the chiyab misa, we don't pater from knas. The yamar be'elonaris, because we say in elonaris and ksubas knas chidishu shechid Torah, that the whole concept of a knas is a chidish of the Torah. It's a novel idea. Hilka chafagav de miktal mishalim. Therefore, even though he's chayiv the death penalty, when it comes to knas, you do have to pay. However, let's say it's just a borrowed cow, it's not a stolen cow, and he slaughters it on Shabbos, then he's potter min hakol, he's totally potter. We don't say that from the moment of borrowing, that's when he's chayiv the keren. Again, that's the whole idea of Rapapa, is that the chayiv is not from the time of the borrowing. We don't say that, therefore he's not chayiv on the keren beforehand. The Kamma b'reshus say we don't say that it's now in his reshus, afilu l'malach hamavis, even if any kind of death would happen. Ela b'shas tvichahu de gazle, rather it's at the moment of the slaughtering that he's now stealing it, Veser Shabbos uganeva boin ke'echon, and therefore the violation of Shabbos and the violation of stealing is at the same time. V'nifter min hakeren, he therefore is potter from paying the principal, mishum de kamle b'deravamine, because of kimle b'deravamine, he gets the stronger punishment of the death penalty. Uknasa leka, there's also no fine in this situation. To ha'ein kefil v'lo arba v'chamisha ela beganav atzmo sheganav mi beis bailim, because you only apply the fine of kefil, or the fine of 4 or 5 times the amount, by a ganav who steals it from the house of the owner. Or it could also be by a shomer chinam, haba liftar asma b'tainas geneva, who's towing tainas geneva, who's trying to get out of it by claiming it was stolen, but it was stolen by a ganav. Aval shoel v'nosei socher v'socher, but all the other kinds of watchmen, a borrower, nosei socher, that they're responsible, shein yicholim lihi potter b'tainas ganav, they're not able to get out of it by claiming ganav. Ein bohen kefil, there is no kefil kedamar b'kama duchti, like we say in many places, lo imamra b'shomer chinam. Again, that's a din only by a shomer chinam that he can end up paying kefil. It's not true by a shomer sacher, etc. And the Gemara continues, Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, V'heshev es ha'gzela asher gazel, it says he returns the stolen item, that which he stole. Ma'atam elomar asher gazel, why does the pasuk have to say the words asher gazel, that he stole? The idea is, Yachzer ke'en shegazel, he returns it as he stole it, the same item. Mikan amar, and from here they say, If he steals it and then feeds it to his children, they are patur from paying. However, but if he leaves it in front of them and the gazela is intact, bein gedolim, bein ketanim chayavin, whether they're adult children, whether they're minors, they're chayiv. However, mishum sumchis amru, but in the name of sumchis they said, gedolim chayavin, ketanim patur. If they're adults, then they're chayiv, but if they're ketanim, then they're patur. As we said before, the idea is you don't bring the ketanim, you don't bring these minors to Bezdin, that's why they are not responsible according to sumchis. And the Gemara continues, Bar Chamud, Rabbi Yirmiyah, the son of the father-in-law of Rabbi Yirmiyah, Tarak Gali Biapi, Rabbi Yirmiyah, he closed the door in the face of Rabbi Yirmiyah. Rabbi Yirmiyah was claiming some property from his father-in-law, and he denied him that property. Also, Lakami de Rabbi Avin, so he came before Rabbi Avin. Amr, said, Shalohu Tovei, he's claiming what is his. Amar Lei said to him, "V'maisina sahadi de'achzaki bei b'chaye de'avua." But I can bring witnesses that I actually had a chazaka while his father was alive, and therefore I do have a right to this property. Amar Lei, he said to him, "V'chi mekavlen edim," but do we accept witnesses? And Rashi explains, "Bar Chamud Rabbi Yirmiyah katan hava." The case over here is that he was a minor. The son of the father-in-law of Rabbi Yirmiyah was a minor, and Rabbi Yirmiyah's father-in-law was no longer alive. Rabbi Yirmiyah was claiming this property. So Tarak Gali Delas Pesucha Beveis Aviv. There was an open door in the house of his father. Sagar, he closed it. The point is, he didn't let Rabbi Yirmiyah get in. Because Rabbi Yirmiyah wanted to take possession of this particular property, and the son, who was a minor, did not want to allow it. And then Rabbi Yirmiyah said, but I made a chazaka actually while the father was alive. He was claiming that the father sold it to him or gave it to him, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Yud Beis Amud Beis.